From far out in space, its dark, sinuous outline can be seen against the golden deserts of northern Africa. From its sources, in the heartland of Central Africa, the Rift Valley Lakes, it flows northward thousands of miles, forming a large, fertile delta on the Mediterranean. It's the world's longest river, the Nile. The Nile, it is said, is the gift of the gods, and Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Its waters nourish a narrow ribbon of life that flourishes between barren deserts. Here, a great civilization arose, whose monuments are as awe-inspiring today as they were when new. On the west bank of the Nile, the cities of the dead, and on the east, the temples of the living gods. These structures have lasted for thousands of years, enduring as the stars, while millions of homes and even the palaces of the Pharaohs have returned to the river mud from which they were built. Today, millions flock to gape in awe at the remnants of a fascinating culture and civilization. A civilization that was already many thousands of years old by the birth of Christ. We marvel at the ruins, at the grandeur. We know the names, names known by more people today than when they were alive. Ramses, Seti, Nefertiti, and Tutankhamun. In their day, the great temples were brilliantly decorated centers of religious and economic activity. Closed to all but a very select few, they towered above the populace, and their political power transcended all but the pharaoh himself. So overwhelming are some of the monuments, and so accurate are their alignments that some people claim that they were observatories, possessed magical powers, or were even built by aliens. How much truth is there in these claims? How did the Egyptians see and use the stars, and what is their legacy to us? Under the powerful floodlights of a different technological civilization, their great monuments stretch before us. Above, the stars still look down. The Egyptians knew them by different names. Sothis, not Sirius. Osiris, not Orion. Horus, not Jupiter. I'm John Rhys-Davies, and these are the stars of the Pharaohs. Of course, to the Egyptians, the stars of the pharaohs weren't stars at all. Just as we might imagine flying saucers flying through the stars, it was as natural for them to imagine the stars as oil lamps, or that the gods traveled across the sky in boats. Oil lamps and boats were the technological marvels of their time. Along the Nile, great temples were built to worship the gods both living and dead. Some have intriguing texts and inscriptions. Some have amazing alignments. All have a purpose that we have had to discover and decipher over many hundreds of years. There's a lot of speculation about their links to the stars. But what is the evidence? Modern science helps us to form today's views of the universe, just as myth, religion, and observational experience helped the Egyptians form the ancient view. There's one major difference. We, who live a modern, urbanized existence, have lost the intimate contact with the heavens that had always been an important part of people's lives until recent times. In the past, people used the stars to tell time, to know the date, and to mark the changes of the seasons. They even depended on moonlight to work by. All these have been replaced by our own technical marvels. Overhead, however, the celestial clock and calendar wheels around just as it did thousands of years ago. and it is still as easy to read, even though the light from the great cities makes it hard to see. Surrounded by a vast desert, with fires, candles, and oil lamps as their only source of light, the night skies of ancient Egypt were star-studdingly brilliant. The night sky was both a reliable source of information and an important home of the gods. Many billions of years ago, our planet was formed out of a vast spinning cloud of debris left over from the formation of our star, the Sun. The debris cloud's spin was transferred to the Sun's family of worlds, causing our planet to circle around the Sun and spin on its axis. Day and night, the seasons and even the year itself are the legacy of these ancient motions. They cause us to need calendars, to have birthdays, and to feel the ebb and flow of time, to take the pulse of our existence. In the ancient Egyptian cosmology, there were a number of creation myths, but one of the most common tells of how a mud pile was created from the waters of chaos. This mound became the land of Egypt. The valley of the mound is commemorated in the gap between the towers of every Egyptian temple. Out of this ocean of chaos arose the creator god, Ra. He in turn was responsible for the many other gods who appeared later. Their intricate relationships were as exotic as any modern-day soap opera. The sky god Nut is depicted as a woman, her arched body forming the starry sky. Between Nut and her husband Geb is the god of the air, Shu. Nut and Geb, the gods of the sky and earth, gave birth to Osiris, who became the god of resurrection. He taught the Egyptians how to irrigate the land, lay out buildings, and plant and harvest grain. He was also associated with the moon and the star pattern we know as Orion. Osiris was murdered by his evil brother Seth. Osiris's son Horus avenged his father's death and flung the severed thigh of Seth high into the sky, where we see it as the Big Dipper. But how do we know this? How do we know what the Egyptians thought? Fortunately, the Egyptians left us with a magnificent legacy, massive buildings covered in pictures and writing. We can read these buildings the way we read a book. This is the Temple of Hathor, about 40 miles south of the modern Egyptian city of Luxor. It's 2,500 years old. That's young by Egyptian standards. The outer walls are noted for their depiction of the famous Queen Cleopatra, her brother Ptolemy, and her son by Julius Caesar, Caesarion. Inside, its ceilings and walls are covered with astronomical symbols, not only from its own time, but also from thousands of years earlier. Some of the sky symbols are easily recognizable as the signs of the zodiac, while others are unfamiliar. The ancient Egyptians had a deeply spiritual relationship with the sky. They believed that order in the heavens maintained order on earth, and heavenly gods transmitted their authority to a living god, the Pharaoh. The stars were used to regulate the lives of the living and the dead. Look at the sky long enough, and you will discover all kinds of useful markers and signs. Signs that help tell the time, reveal the passage of the year, and even our location on the surface of the Earth. Have you noticed that as the stars were turning, they all seem to rotate around a central point in the sky? There is even a bright star nearby which doesn't move very much. Draw a line from this star to the horizon, and we have an important marker. We call it north. It never moves. Directly across from north, there's another marker, south. Facing south, we can observe the stars as they move across the sky, rising and setting. Risings occur in the east and settings in the west. The exact points of east and west are markers that equally divide the space between north and south. We know these four markers as the cardinal points. It was here that the Egyptians imagined that four goddesses held up the sky. At certain times of the year, the sun rises and sets exactly east and west. Another important marker for the calendar. The rising of certain bright stars was used to tell the passage of time throughout the night. These stars came to be known as the decans. Since the night sky was slowly rotating, every 10 days these stars marked a different hour of the night. Of course, not all stars rise and set. Some circle around continuously like grooves in an old record. For the Egyptians, these were important stars, the imperishables, for they were visible every night. In a land of few clouds and no rain, this meant forever. Naturally, the point around which the heavens moved was important as well. They thought of it as a stake held by a heavenly hippopotamus. The Egyptians didn't know why the heavens moved. Neither did they try to find out. After all, this was the work of the gods. Today we know this daily motion of the sun and stars is caused by the spinning of the Earth on its axis once every 24 hours. The reason why one place doesn't seem to move is because that's where the top and bottom or poles of the Earth point. In our civilization, we call this star the North Star, or Polaris, and it belongs to a group of stars known as the Little Bear or the Little Dipper. Remember how Horus threw the severed leg of Seth into the heavens? Well, here it is. The Big Dipper, or the Great Bear, is made up of these 7 bright stars. For the Egyptians, this pattern of stars was magical and linked to the resurrection of a dead pharaoh. It was called Mesketiu, the same name as the special tool that breathed life into a mummy. Once again, we see that the Egyptians strongly associated the stars with the afterlife. We use names and star patterns that have been handed down to us largely from the ancient Greeks. Certainly the ancient Egyptians didn't join the dots to make the same patterns as we do, but later they added some familiar shapes. In the great zodiac ceiling of Dendera, we can recognize a few well-known signs like the scorpion, or the lion, and Pisces the fish. But there are also a lot of others, like the hippo, not so familiar to us. If we look closely, however, we can also spot the limb of Seth near the center, with ropes attached to the constellation of the hippo, who is holding the stake marking the central rotation point of the heavens. Actually, that is one of the major differences between the night skies of the pharaohs and the skies that we can see tonight. The place around which the stars revolved is different. It has shifted. Presently, the star Polaris is close to the spot. But thousands of years ago, a different star marked the pole. As the Earth spins on its axis, it wobbles ever so slowly. Over a short period, it isn't noticeable, but over thousands of years, the wobbling pole of the Earth traces out a great circle in the sky. Let's travel back now about 5,000 years or so. When the pyramids were under construction, the pole of the sky was pointing to this star. We know it as Thuban, one of the stars in the constellation of Draco the Dragon. That is where the great hippo held the stars firm. For the pharaoh entombed in the Great Pyramid, this spot marked the top of his path to the stars and eternal life. Dating from 2600 BC, there are about 80 known pyramids, all on the west side of the Nile. They all mark the tombs of royalty, and of all of them, 3 stand out: the magnificent pyramids of the Giza Plateau. Over 5,000 years old, effaced by time, man, and the desert, they are still an impressive sight. When newly built, they were covered in a beautiful limestone casing, and each was topped in gold. It's said they were designed to resemble the slanting rays of the sun. The truth is, we don't really know the builder's intentions, but it's possible that the pyramids were also meant to resemble the original mound of creation. The largest of the pyramids, known as the Cheops pyramid, was built as the resting place for the pharaoh Khufu. There are ancient drawings of pharaohs helping to lay out buildings, and it's possible that Khufu did the same for his colossal tomb. The Cheops pyramid certainly deserves the title great. It has over 2 million stone blocks, each weighing many tons. It covers an area of some 13 acres. And is 460 feet high. Yet it is aligned to the cardinal points and to the stars with amazing accuracy. One shaft, pointing to the star Thuban, extends all the way from the outer casing of the pyramid through layer upon layer of stone until it reaches the king's burial chamber. You can't see the star from inside this chamber, but remember, this was not a telescope or an observatory. This shaft was a transit point where the king could journey from his tomb to join the imperishable stars in the afterlife. Here he could conduct his work in the heavens, just as he did while alive on Earth. Some people have suggested that the Giza pyramids and others were built and positioned on the ground to mirror the position of the stars in and around Orion. Unfortunately, to make this work, Egypt has to be turned upside down. But that is what often happens to the truth with pyramid theories. A different shaft in the Great Pyramid points to another celestial destination, to the stars in this constellation, the one we call Orion, and which to the Egyptians represented the god Osiris. His wife, Isis, travels close behind as the embodiment of Sirius, a very important star in the Egyptian firmament. Together with Osiris and Sirius, the king continued to work in the heavens, ensuring the cycle of the seasons and the regulation of the calendar. Osiris was murdered by his brother Seth in the 28th year of his reign. His body was cut up into 14 parts and hidden all over Egypt. Isis collected the parts and brought his mummified body back to life for only one night. Having conceived their son Horus, she hid herself from Seth for 70 days. The numbers 28, 14, and 70 are very significant here because they are directly related to events in the heavens. Let's go back to Dendara, to that magnificent temple of Hathor. This ceiling relates to the moon and its changing appearance, what we call its phases. Here we see the four goddesses of the cardinal points holding up the sky symbol. In the boat, on top, are Osiris and his wife Isis. The inscription says, "Osiris is the moon." Moving along, we see 14 gods on ascending stairs that lead to the disk of the full moon. Inside is the celestial eye, the symbol of Osiris, the moon. This is followed by another lunar disk with 14 gods accompanying the celestial eye. This could represent the 14 days of the dying moon as it goes from full brightness back into darkness. The phases of the moon formed the basis of the first Egyptian calendar. Unlike the Greeks, the Egyptians didn't try, as far as we know, to explain why the moon's appearance changed over time. Today we understand that the changing pattern of light and dark is caused by it revolving around the Earth. As the moon goes once around the Earth, it also rotates once on its axis. Therefore, the same side of the moon always points at the Earth. From the Earth, it looks as though the moon stands still as light moves across it. From space, we see that as the moon moves around in its orbit, sunlight is able to light different parts of the surface. When the sun and the moon are on opposite sides of the Earth, sunlight completely illuminates the side of the moon that we can see, and we say that the moon is full. When the moon and sun are on the same side of the Earth, no light reaches the side that we can see, so we call this phase the new moon. It takes about 30 days for this cycle to be repeated. The Egyptian lunar year consisted of 12 months, each of 30 lunar days, making a total of 360. This calendar quickly got out of order, so every 3 years or so, an additional month was added to correct the problem. The moon calendar was used for religious purposes. A different calendar was used for civil functions. It had 365 days. The Egyptian astronomers knew that a year was actually 365 days as measured by the stars. But what is a year? It's easy for us. We know that it is the length of time that the Earth takes to orbit the sun once. The Egyptians didn't. As the Earth moves around the sun, the stars appear to move across the sky, and the night sky changes. Seasonal star patterns move from the night sky to the daytime sky, where they are lost in the sun's glare for 70 days. When the stars finally return to the night sky, they appear at the very end of the night, rising in the sky just before dawn. So the Egyptian astronomers watched for the yearly return of Sirius, the brightest star in the sky. The first sighting of Sirius marked the start of the new year, and coincidentally, soon after, the Nile would swell up and flood, bringing life to the parched land. This was the most important event in the life of Egypt. In a land without rain, the river was the giver of life, and its recurring cycle was the gift of the gods. Just as Isis had revived Osiris, now, as Sirius, she revived the land. The 70-day disappearance of Sirius was the same duration that Osiris had spent in the underworld. So here is a celestial cycle reflected in a cycle of life, death, and rebirth on Earth. This is the Valley of the Kings on the west side of the Nile, the fabulous resting place for the richest and most important pharaohs of Egypt. Here their mortal bodies lay preserved while they performed their duties as gods in the heavens. We're inside the fabled tomb of King Tutankhamun. Looking over the north wall, we see the mummified body of the pharaoh. It has been prepared for 70 days, the same number of days that Sirius is absent from the night sky. On the right is the priest Ai, the king's successor. Look at the object he has in his hand. It is a special tool, a misketu. See the shape? It resembles the shape of the Big Dipper. It was applied to the mouth and the eyes of the mummy and restored the personality of the mummy for survival in the afterlife. Looking down, we see the table with an adze, some implements, and the leg of a bull. It represents the thigh of Seth, which Horus threw into the sky. Together with the dipper-like tool and the constellation itself, it represents the renewal of the king's life. He is now as immortal as the stars themselves. The ceremony also acts as a formal transfer of the dead king's authority to his successor Ai. Ai's clothing is also significant. It's a leopard skin. This is said to represent the starry sky. A similar outfit was found here in the tomb, where the spots were replaced by golden stars. As we move along the wall, we see the king being welcomed by the gods of the underworld, and on the other wall are the 12 baboons. Each represented one of the 12 hours of the night. It was the ancient Egyptians who gave us the 24-hour day. Tutankhamun is probably one of the most well-known names in the world, but his real name was Tutankhaten. He was forced to change his name after a bitter religious division over the worship of the sun god Ra and the image of the sun called the Aten. By 1500 BC, the creator and sun god Ra had been merged with the god Amun, and Amun-Ra was worshipped as the most powerful of all the gods. As Ra, he sailed across the sky in his celestial boat, bringing light and life to the world he created. At night, he had to survive an endurance test. It was an amazing and death-defying voyage with all kinds of struggles and trials to overcome. This included winning a battle with the evil snake Apophis. If he survived, the sun would be reborn each day. If not, who knows? Sunrise was never guaranteed, but Ra always won. In another one of the ceiling registers in the Dendara temple, we also discover the story of what happened to Ra each evening. The ceiling is blackened by the soot from the fires of the people who lived here for centuries. We can recreate the original colored appearance. Here we see the explanation of nightfall. The sun, the god Ra, is swallowed by the goddess Nut. Traveling through her body during the long hours of the nights, he prevails over Apophis and emerges to bring light to a new day. Amun-Ra was not only all-powerful in the heavens, but also on earth. His temples were the richest and most beautiful. In some ways, his priests were more powerful than the pharaoh. Whether it was to get power back from the priests or the result of a true religious experience, the pharaoh Amenhotep III began to believe that he was a living god, and that the Aten, the god of the image of the sun, was all-powerful. The Aten is shown as the solar disk with hands extending down towards humanity. His son Amenhotep IV gradually took things further until about 5 years into his reign, he set off a religious bombshell. He changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning servant of Aten. He declared that the Aten was the most important god and outlawed the worship of most of the others, including Amun-Ra. Together with his queen, the famous Nefertiti, he founded a new city and made the civil service and the royal court move there. Only he, the pharaoh, not the priests, could commune with the new god, and the power of the priests was diminished. It was a remarkable period in the history of Egypt. The pharaoh was preoccupied with serving the god Aten. The great and ancient temples were left to rack and ruin, their fabulous wealth squandered, and the all-powerful priesthood rendered powerless. The empire was allowed to crumble, and border encroachments were ignored. The army and the priesthood were sidelined and upset. Their resentment came to a head when Akhenaten died. His city was destroyed, his monuments defaced, and perhaps even his corpse mutilated. Amun and his priests had their revenge. Akhenaten's eventual successor, Tutankhaten, had his name changed to Tutankhamun, meaning the living image of the Amun. The Aten was forced back into obscurity. The old gods were back in business, the old guard was back in power. The Amun temples and their priesthood were restored. The pharaohs never forgot the importance of their link with the heavens, either before or after death. Perhaps the most successful of these pharaohs was Ramses II, whose colossal statues dominate his great temple of Abu Simbel. Here, on the anniversary of Ramses' birth, the rays of that powerful sun god Amun-Ra penetrate the darkness of the temple. In the deep interior shrine, the light of the sun illuminates the image of Ramses as both god and king, and his link between heaven and earth is complete. While the Egyptians gave us the 24-hour day and the 365-day year, they didn't try, like the ancient Greeks, to explain in scientific terms how the sun, the planets, and the stars moved, or even where they were. For them, the heavens were the realm of the gods. The sky embodied the balance between order and chaos, between death and rebirth. The god-kings lived on earth and then journeyed to the heavens to reign forever with the imperishable stars. So next time you look up at a shimmering, starlit sky, just think, these are the stars that Tutankhamun hunted under, that Nefertiti sang under, and that the army of Ramses marched under. To us, the stars are no longer a place of religious mystery. They are, instead, the doorway into a magnificent universe that is much more wondrous than the Egyptians could ever have imagined. A universe whose secrets we have only now begun to understand. The pharaohs imagined that they could travel to the stars. Now, 5,000 years later, we have embarked on the first steps of a journey which may make that dream come true.